Hi there, my name is Andy Farquharson and I'm your host on Alternative Exit,
the podcast dedicated to educating small business owners about the possibilities, benefits and challenges of transitioning to an employee ownership model. Did you know that there are over 200 million SMEs around the globe with an owner that will be retiring within the next 10 years? Many of these owners will never actually find a buyer for their business, forcing them to close their doors, wreaking havoc on their employees and the communities. There is an alternative. This show will explore different forms of employee ownership and the best practices for a successful transition. Each episode is going to feature interviews with experts on employee ownership, business owners who've successfully made the transition, and consultants who've helped facilitate these changes.
Okay, now let's get on with the show.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Alternative Exit. Today's guest is Mark Hand. Now, Mark is a scholar and advocate in the field of employee ownership and workplace democracy and works out of the University of Texas, and he's also on the board of PTON, which is the Purpose Trust Ownership Network. Now, if you haven't already engaged with his weekly newsletter, The Stakehold, you are absolutely missing out on all the happenings in the world of employee ownership, the ownership economy, purpose trusts, ESOPs, and just the broader implications of sort of democratic ownership and participation. So today we're going to explore, I guess, a whole bunch of different conversations, sort of all associated around his work and sort of the content that Mark produces. So Mark, welcome to the Alternative Exit.
I'm so happy to be here, Andy. I've followed your work and what you're putting together, and I love the experimentation that you're doing and how it is that you're trying to reach out to new audiences. So I feel grateful to be here.
Yeah, look, and look, it feels the same to you. Like a lot of the knowledge and the knowledge about the space that comes from your weekly musings, which are awesome, and also provide me a list of potential podcast guests, which is also very helpful.
Yeah, happy for it. Yeah.
I mean, look, you've obviously dedicated a lot of your career towards this sort of idea of democratic ownership. I mean, what has driven you towards this?
Sure. So, in a lot of ways, it's a sort of the rug that pulls together a lot of different aspects of my career. So I started my career in community development and sort of local community development, and was driven to that by observing as a college student for the first time the level of inequality that existed at that point in Latin American countries. I mean, now the United States is sort of Latin Americanized in its inequality. But I spent time sort of in community development, and then I spent time as an impact investor, investing in social enterprises. And I've always been interested in politics and power. And so when my friend and colleague Zoe Schlag, who runs Common Trust, which is an investment fund for employee ownership trusts in the United States, when she said, "Hey, I think this area could be interesting to you. I think you might actually really enjoy learning about it," I started looking into it, and I was hooked. I mean, right from the gate, it was a way to talk about how do we make relationships more equitable in their interactions, which to me is the language of democracy, and then how to make sure that the benefits of the companies that we're creating are actually spread to the people that are affected by those companies and contribute to the development of those companies. And what I've found since, and part of the reason that I stay so interested and excited about all of this is that it's so varied. I mean, there are folks that are coming in from the steward ownership world, and they have a very specific view about how companies should look. And then there are the ESOP people, which have a very different view. There are the sort of the folks more focused on democratic management of companies and democratic leadership styles. And so all of this is this kind of right now evolving market of ideas and philosophies and structures and mechanisms that makes it really fun to study and to keep writing about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is a hell of a journey. I think obviously the thread that I love that sort of pulls it back together for you it's like it comes back to sort of that focus you've got on doing work with the community, all the way back to sort of that the community sort of development work. Because
that's right. I mean, yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, mate, what sort of just keeps what keeps coming up in a lot of these conversations is that there's just so many upsides. There's so many different upsides for these types of movements. But there's one part that you did bring up there, which I think is sort of something really interesting, because people are like, there's a lot more sort of talk. I mean, we're seeing a sort of the rise of like the purpose organizations, like the Patagonia sort of really sort of put a flag out there and to raise awareness. And but then there are sort of a bunch of people who are also focused on pretty much how to distribute wealth, like as sort of one of the key benefits of these types of models. But then you've also got like the sort of rise of self-managed organizations and participatory sort of workplaces. I mean, how do you see all those three coming together? And do you see any tensions?
Sure. I love this question. So I'm working on a report right now with Mariah Besharov at the Skull Center at Oxford on this kind of question, because sort of what we see is that there are groups all over the world from different parts of different economies that are asking questions generally about what companies are for and why do they exist? Why do governments charter them and set certain rules for how they should operate? And so we've started thinking about it in three distinct ways, which is that there's a question about what is the organization's purpose beyond itself. So of course, most companies want to make money, but most companies also have a reason for making that money. That is behind that. And sometimes that's community focused. Sometimes it's, I grew up in poverty and I don't want my kids to be that way. There are all kinds of sort of reasons that people, or purposes that people come to a business with. And then the question becomes, how does that purpose expand outside of the founder? And how does it get locked in to the structure of the company? And so that's one dimension in which we see companies playing, whether that's through purpose trust ownership, or steward ownership, or benefit corporations. And then another dimension along which we see people playing is how do we distribute the financial benefits that are created here? And that, that can be the founder owns 100% of the company and claims 100% of the profits, or it can be a 100% ESOP owned company where all of the revenue is distributed to employees, or you could have organizations in the middle, sort of not worker cooperatives, but sort of platform cooperatives that organize finance flows in a different way for the people that operate on the platform. So that's the second dimension. And then the third, which is the one that's really interesting to me. So I teach political science, and all that means is that we're interested in power. And so I'm really interested in how it is that power is handled inside of these organizations. Who has what kind of say at what level? And that can happen formally or it can happen informally. But there are very few companies that operate in the sort of ideal, military style top-down hierarchy. Most companies, that either is not the formal way, or even if it is the formal way, informally, it's not how that happens. And so power is distributed in really interesting ways across organizations. And so those are the three dimensions that we're interested in studying. I do think they bring some tensions, which we can talk about. But on balance, my suspicion is that they're synergistic. And there's an author that I love from the early 20th century. Her name is Mary Follett. And she talks about organizations needing a common purpose. And by that, she meant a purpose commonly decided, commonly determined, and commonly maintained. And I think that that's the direction on which companies are going to see the most benefits from making some of these moves.
Yeah, I mean, I do love that point. I mean, this sort of harks back to John Shell's sort of episode as well, where he did talk about like you don't need to have distributed ownership to have a great company culture and have everyone working in the same direction. And I think you see that with what Frederick Laloux was talking about in his book, sort of reinventing organizations, sort of like Morningstar, where everyone sort of over there, the tomato grower or processor in California, it's still owned by one person, but they've still got this totally decentralized approach to power and also like purpose. So, but I still really struggle with that. Like the fact, how do you distribute the power without distributing the wealth?
Sure. So, many organizations are not primarily about distributing wealth. So if you think about hospitals or universities, or like, even some sort of old local neighborhood banks, like they had sort of generating wealth was not the primary purpose of those things. And so I think that if you start to separate out that, sort of how the company is run versus who benefits financially from it, then you can start to get a little bit more playful on both sides. Now, I think that in most organizations, if you give people a lot of decision-making power, somebody's going to look around and say, wait a minute, who's getting all the money from all of this hard work? And likewise, when you make employees owners, it might make them more likely to look around and say, well, sure, I'm getting some of the benefit here, but my job still sucks. And I would like to reorganize how my job looks and who I'm reporting to. And shouldn't I do that because I'm an owner? And so I do think that taking steps in one direction or the other is likely to lead companies to take steps along those other dimensions. But I think the fun thing is that you don't necessarily have to. There's a really interesting company in Germany called WeTel. It's a telecom provider, and they became steward owned. And so the company is owned by steward, or I guess it's not owned by a trust, but it's
foundation,
it's owned by a foundation, probably a foundation. I'm regretting that I've lost that detail. But when they made that commitment, they found out their employees were more excited about working for the company because the employees knew that this company would exist in perpetuity and be committed to the purpose that the employees were excited about. And so employee engagement went up. But then employees started wanting to engage more at a decision-making level. And so now they're figuring out how to move employees up in the decision-making hierarchy in the company.
Okay.
So that's one example.
I mean, look, a lot of people sort of talk about, that the whole management sort of mode of the last sort of 15, 20 years has been get people aligned to the purpose. Okay. We build the culture, we build the values. But in many organizations, it's just lip service. People sort of aren't living that. I mean, what are you seeing in these organizations where they are really where they do have that purpose? How are they bringing that forward into the front line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work on that. One of my colleagues, Melissa Hoover, is focused on specifically that question of how do you, at Apis and Heritage, how do you build an ownership culture? How do you sort of pull everybody on side behind a common purpose? And I think that as in the WeTel example, that it's a reaction to some of what you're talking about, which is that we all kind of knew intuitively that a lot of these publicly traded companies that were talking about values and purpose and stakeholder capitalism, we all kind of had this suspicion that when push came to shove, that they would back down because they're legally obligated to maximize value for shareholders. And so so if you view it that way, then a lot of that work wasn't about aligning people behind purpose, but it was about aligning people enough behind purpose that we could make more money. And so the value to me of some of these models, from benefit corporations to purpose trust ownership to steward ownership, is that you can demonstrate that it's not lip service. You can lock yourself in to a path that gives your employees the knowledge that when push comes to shove, that you can't back out. And I think that's a really powerful move in the companies that I've seen to then convince other stakeholders, consumers, employees, suppliers, that you're committed to a particular path and to a particular purpose.
Okay, so you think that so if I'm sort of playing that back, it sounds like that structure, having something really cemented in the structure, whether that be as a purpose or a purpose trust, or even sort of that employee ownership, having something that's sort of irrevocable that says that, hey, look, this is what our company is aligned to, means that that's when sort of employees can have more belief in it.
I think that's right. So I should say that I haven't seen research on this yet. I think it's one of the areas that I'm curious about is what is the effect on employee engagement of converting to some of these forms. But if you think about something like a benefit corporation, it's kind of remarkable that in the United States that thousands of companies have now taken some flexibility to react to the markets off the table by becoming a benefit corporation. It's not totally locked in. They can unwind the benefit corporation if they want to at some point, but that's hard to do. And so it does feel to me like there are consumers out there that will support companies in making the decision to try to manage the tension between the purpose of an organization and making money inside of the organization.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, we do see we do see some great sort of like employee-owned companies and benefit and purpose companies. You're really utilizing that as a marketing tool to be able to sort of create that. I mean, have you seen any data, or have you sort of anecdotally how much that actually has an impact on purchase behavior for the customers?
Not yet, no. And I think that's one of the really exciting areas of research is sort of as these companies make these commitments, then what are some of the impact? Like what impact does that have? The B Lab folks would clearly argue that that companies are choosing to put the B on the side of their shampoo bottle because they think the consumers are going to make decisions differently. I think it will be the same with purpose trust ownership at some point, or with employee ownership at some point, but it's going to take work like what you're doing in order to make the benefit of that and those purposes more public. I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me is that in the United States, at least, that there are as many employee owners as there are private sector labor union members.
Really?
Unions are yeah, right. It is surprising because unions are sort of part of the public consciousness. People have an opinion about unions one way or the other, but most people don't have that same level of consciousness about employee ownership. And even most employee owners, I think, don't view themselves as part of a wider movement. They view themselves as owners of a particular company. So unions have been able to figure out how to build sort of a consciousness among that group of people that they have an identity. And I think that that's probably necessary here too.
Well, do you think it's necessary, or do you also think it could be a hindrance? I mean, I think because some of the sort of challenges that I see when I tell people about employee ownership, like it's just, hey, look, this is communism, or this is socialism, or this is something that the businesses will never rally around. Like, and they've sort of got this vision of societal level communal ownership and impact and influence, which, look, the history has told us has not really worked well, like in a lot of instances. And some might say, look, unions have sometimes, in some instances, sort of taken on life of their own that hasn't actually been purely for the benefit of their owners. Like, so when you're going sort of across these broader movements, it creates different types of sort of power elements of power within there. But when you have much smaller, localized sort of collective ownership, like or collective purpose, it can be much more powerful because people can impact it. How do you think about that?
Sure. So, one of the reasons I'm attracted to this work is that if it happens at one company, then it can radically change the lives of the people at that company, and nothing else needs to happen, right? No large overhaul of the economic system needs to occur in order for one company to make the decision to become employee owned and then share the benefits of that company. And so the idea that we could make moves without having to depend on some radical shift to see change, that's really exciting. That's interesting to me, just pragmatically speaking. And I think, I share with you a general skepticism of size, of large. And so what I don't mean to say here is that all companies should operate the same way, or that we should restructure our economies in that way. But I do think that if there was a world in which employee owners viewed themselves as a cohort, then it would be something that they would tell other people about. So right now, most of the communication about employee ownership comes from the top down, which is odd, right? So it's how do we get owners to start thinking about this, right? But if you're in a town that's got 3 or 4 employee-owned firms, and those people are excited about that fact, and they see themselves as a community, they're going to tell other people about it. And maybe there's a world in which workers start to push for employee ownership. And I think, it is absolutely the case that especially in the United States, that when I talk about this first, that you sort of see people's eyebrows go up. Maybe that's less the case in Europe, where you all have found a little bit more balance between these two systems. But I think it is a misconception in the sense that there are certainly folks in this world that are flag carrying Marxists. But a lot of the folks in this world are trying to figure out how to build a business and operate business inside of the capitalist systems that we have. And so, one of the things that I'll tell people is that stat about how many employee owners there are. 10% of the world's workforce works for or gets some revenue from a worker cooperative or a producer cooperative. there's something like another 10 million Americans that have employee stock options in addition to ESOPs. And so it's already a major part of our economy. We just don't seem to view it that way or understand it that way. And I think,
No.
hopefully that's some of what you're shifting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is funny. I often sort of find myself in the room with like venture capitalists and like of different flavors, and like a lot of the times that they don't believe that employee owners are going to be good stewards of a business.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think.
That is, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, like it's this sort of, I don't know where this long held belief that they don't, without a strong hand on the wheel, or that employee ownership means that there isn't going to be that strong hand on the wheel guiding the direction of the company.
I love this question because as a political scientist, like those are the kinds of questions that I'm curious about. And in one of my courses on democratic theory, I include a speech from Hitler in which he argues, look, you capitalists, he's speaking to a group of industrialists in Dusseldorf, I believe. And he says, look, you all wouldn't let your workers run the business because it would become mediocre if you allowed that to happen. So you need to have a strong hand at the wheel in order to manage these companies effectively. Just like that, in a country, we shouldn't let everyone make decisions. We need to have a strong hand at the wheel. And so you should get rid of this democracy stuff and let the best of us, which is me, run the country. And I think one of the curiosities to me is that in the political world, we have decided generally, not universally, and things are backsliding now, but we have decided that actually we don't have to have a king. We could run things more democratically. And there are a ton of different ways to do it. Like Finland's system is different than the United States. It's different than Germany's. It's different than France's. And so with something that complex as a country, if we can figure out how to operate them in a way that obviates the need for a dictator, then like why wouldn't we be able to do that in a company, which is actually a much simpler structure. And I think that some of the issue is that when people hear democratic, they think, one person, one vote. And then somewhere back in their head is Alex de Tocqueville talking about the tyranny of the majority. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful to research about is ways that companies have become more democratic in some ways that are different than just that majoritarian one person, one vote democracy, because there are a ton of different ways to do it.
Yeah, I think that's we see that in lots of different formations of these sort of employee-owned, purpose-built sort of companies like that, and how they actually sort of piece together, because it is a lot of people just align it to one person, one vote and cooperatives in that way, when we've seen sort of really great businesses operate in very, very different ways.
And is also not always true cooperative. Like sometimes they use the one person, one vote to set up representative systems, right? So then they look more like modern representative democracies than sort of Athenian direct democracies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how do you in terms of that? Because I mean, I guess that's sort of where we see these like more representative democracies. We also see that a lot in self-managed organizations where people are sort of huddling together more in groups, like smaller groups, where they're able to sort of contribute, have more influence on each other. What do you see that how do you see that impacting people's engagement and people's people's happiness when they're sort of collaborating on things that they can influence?
Sure. So what I have found, and this sort of tracks with how I think about democracy, which is that the more we keep the conversation going and the more we have sight on what is happening from multiple people who have a voice in the conversation, the more nimble we'll be, the more adaptable we'll be to a changing environment. And so one example that I love, I got to sit in on a board meeting of an employee ownership trust here in Texas called ACP International. And they now have a board that has a couple of employee representatives on it. So that's the governing function of the organization. And in practice, the owner has still made a lot of the final decisions because people trust the owner to do that along most vectors. And so they retain the power to be able to say, you, Joe, go make this decision, right? And that works because it centralizes decision making, but keeps the actual power with the people. And
So
one of the
to do
things,
that, did they align on did they have like a governance structure of what type of
right.
decisions that the founder can make or what other ones need to go back to the board?
And so they started doing that. And then one of the things that's really interesting to me, and sort of to the point about having more eyes everywhere, is that at some point one of the employees was struggling, and another one of the employees on the board started collecting money from other employees, and in order to help them get through this medical event, and that turned into a rotating individual loan structure that employees contribute to and employees control. And it's the sort of innovation in how to take care of each other that I think emerges when you get more voices in the room. You just get to see more, and then you get to solve more problems.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's awesome. So, look, I wanted to sort of transition the conversation a little bit, because we've talked about lots of different ways in which we can set up a company or establish sort of a business or an organization to be able to deliver deliver sort of great outcomes for the workers, for the business. But as we think about the silver tsunami of all these different transitions that are happening now, it's creating it's obviously going to be the greatest transfer of wealth in history. This is coming at the time when there is the greatest sort of disparity of wealth that we've seen since the Gilded Age, and look, worker disengagement's also at the highest level since it's been recorded. Right? I mean, how do you see why do you see how are you seeing the motivations of sellers? Like, what are they thinking? Are they thinking they want to maximize their outcomes? Do they want to leave a legacy? Do they? Yeah. What are you seeing in your research?
I mean, this is another fun question. So, I think at a societal level, if we're policymakers looking at the silver tsunami, then the role that we can play is to figure out how to set up incentives using the governmental structures that we can control, in order to push people in the direction that would be good for our communities and our voters, right? And so I can imagine a world in which each state actually incentivizes different kinds of ownership based on their local economies and what they think is necessary in order for those economies to run. But at the owner level, I just published a paper with a friend of mine at Washington University in St. Louis. And one of the things that we talked about in that paper was that owners are also human with other motivations in roles that they play, in addition to being owners. And so if you take a business owner, they are a mother or a father, a child, a member of a religious community. They are the owner of their business. They have a group of friends that they interact with that they want to take care of. They're part of a neighborhood. And so all of these things are live in a person. Mm-hmm. But if you get approached by a private equity company and they say, we want to build your business, the identity of yours that gets triggered is the money-making business owner identity. And so you're going to operate as such. And then it's going to be kind of silly for you actually to consider things other than the financial benefit to you of this transaction, or how does this affect my wider community? But if you have somebody come to you and say, like, what is it? Like, what is the game that you really want to be playing here? What matters to you as an individual? Then it can surface that, you know what, I go to this church and it runs a food bank and I want to make sure that gets a ton of money. Or I have to go to the grocery store every week and I see all of my employees there because this town is small enough and I want to take care of them. I don't want to have to look the other way when I go into the grocery store because I've sold my company to somebody that then fired them. And so I think that if you approach owners with that level of complexity in mind, that you can actually trigger some of those other motivations that owners have. This same owner that I was talking about before in Texas, I've used this line a few times, but I just love it. That he said he chose an employee ownership trust because he saw friends of his sell to private equity companies, private equity firms, and they left with fat wallets and broken hearts. And I think it speaks to me to the fact that humans, yes, we have wallets, and we also have hearts, and that some of these structures can actually be more fitting to who we are as people.
Yeah. Well, that's tough for a lot of people to understand. I mean, I think especially when people of the generation, I mean, they don't have a strong history of really being sort of connected with their emotions and really sort of understanding like how to go drive through that. What do you think is the sort of the moments that you see that sort of help people understand like that other identity that that sort of more connected to the legacy of their team?
Sure. I mean, I think some of it is just asking that question, is saying for advisors, for funders, for investors in companies that are transitioning to employee ownership, to start with those kinds of questions of what matters to you. Not what amount of money do you need to make out of this first, but what are the things that are important to you as a human? And most people have some things. They have their children, and they have their neighborhoods, and they have their communities, and they have their congregations, and all of these other connections, these different games that they operate in. And so I think that it doesn't have to be a sort of emotionally excavating conversation, but I think that just asking the question and getting people to think that way will free up some space in owners' minds to be able to consider that actually I don't have to only think about maximizing my financial take from this. Like, that's a choice that I'm making. And I think that one of the things that sticks out to me as really necessary is to help free owners from the fear that if they do anything other than maximize their financial take from a sale, that they're being silly, that they're being naive, that they're not seeing the world as it is. And I would say actually that part of what the issue is that our commitment to the idea of shareholder value maximization, even if the private owner is the only shareholder there, that our commitment to that has actually blinded us to the ways that humans interact with each other and what is possible. So my hope is to help owners open up some of those possibilities and then identify the values on which they're making their decisions.
Yeah, I love that. Also, the way that you articulate sort of obviously the pure focus around shareholder maximization is sort of as being not so much at the root of evil, but it's just been a really sort of clear point as to it's been driving a lot of behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't come up with it, right? There's a famous Jewish philosopher about 2,000 years ago who said that money was the root of all evil. And so, it wasn't us that came out of this, that came up with this on the spot. But I do think that view is one that works for a lot of things, right? It has led to specialization, which has led to wealth creation, which means less poverty. Like, all of that is true. And it's just one way to view humans, which are deeply complex and conflicted in our desires, emotions, and values.
Yeah, absolutely. So you obviously, with the work that you're doing at the Stakehold, you're at the crossroads of a lot of different information and innovation and news, sort of what's happening in these sort of more participatory and democratic workplaces. What are some of the things that have come across, like the innovations that are really exciting you about the future?
That's a fun question. When we started this, it was a student that suggested this. A student of mine, Megan Garvey, who suggested that we start a weekly newsletter on this stuff, in large part because we were learning about it. And so having a weekly newsletter then forced us to look at the Google alerts every week. And it took 2.5 years or so for that to turn into actually something that made anybody any money. But what it has done for me is it's given me a chance to see across the landscape of what some people call the ownership economy. And so, yes, I think that we need to own larger parts of the corporations that we work for. But I'm also really interested in how it is that people own real estate and how those decisions are made. I'm interested in who owns our data and how it is that we might build companies that operate our data a little bit differently, which we should also own. And then I think there's really, like, honestly, the Trump bonds from a few weeks ago are an expression, at least, of the idea that more Americans should have ownership in the stock market, which is where a lot of value creation sits. And so, to me, the most exciting thing is the breadth of experimentation that's going on right now. And it is hard to talk about all at once, and I think that that's good because I want 1,000 different experiments in this direction of we should own more of the economy, which is the name of a book that a friend of mine, Elle, is coming out with this year.
Okay. Very cool. So, well, look, I won't put the pressure on you to highlight sort of one or two of those. Like, I think it's a really good call to action for people to actually go in and check out the Stakehold, like on a regular basis to be across that. But as we sort of are coming close to the end, at the end of every pod, I do ask I do ask everyone a fast round of questions. So how does it sound if I offer you a quick 3 questions, you give a quick response?
Go for it.
You ready? Okay, so who is the leader that you most admire in employee ownership?
The first couple that come to mind are Zoe Schlag, who I think is running one of those experiments right now. The second one that comes to mind is Melissa Hoover, who I mentioned before, who is at the Democracy of Work Institute and is, I think, so clear-eyed about all of these different values and facets of this world. So those are the first 2 that come to mind, but I'm sure that I'll kick myself for not coming up with a third in a minute.
Well, hopefully they don't kick you as well. But anyway, secondly, what is your favorite resource on employee ownership?
My favorite resource on employee ownership. I go regularly back to Rutgers' Clio website. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's the compilation of learning on employee ownership. Because I think from an academic perspective, it's the most comprehensive resource about what academics know about this. And so if you're a master's student or a young PhD student who's interested in learning more about what we actually know about employee ownership, that's probably where I would start.
Okay, fantastic. And then finally, what would you say to a business owner who's sitting on the fence regarding a transition to an employee-owned model?
Sure. I think the first thing is to consider that there are many options available to you, and that your existing advisors may not know all of them, or they may actually have some misunderstandings about some of them. And so my first piece of advice would be for owners to open up their imaginations a little bit to all of the different possibilities for how they might leave this company. And then the second one, I think, would be to start with this question of who are you and what matters to you, and what identities of yours, what communities of yours do you want to leave a legacy for? And that might lead an owner to taking one of those private equity transactions because they want to give all of that money away to a local immigrant rights group. But it might lead other owners to other decisions. And so I think that rooting down in those values will allow owners to then play the game that they want to play, instead of playing the game of shareholder value maximization by default.
Yeah, love it. Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for your time today. Mate, where can people go if they want to follow more of you?
Well, of course, I'm going to plug the stakehold.com, which we publish every week. And then we repost that online on my LinkedIn page every week as well. So those would be the 2 places I'd go. And for folks that are interested in purpose trust ownership, Piton's website is trustownership.org, and y'all should check it out.
Okay, fantastic. We'll have some links in the show notes. But look, Mark, thank you so much for keeping us all abreast of everything that's happening in this space. As I said, it is... But by reading the Stakehold and following you, it sort of helps you understand that there is a lot of movement, and it's very, very exciting. And so, but sometimes it can be lonely when you're out there on sort of the outer edges of doing something new. So thank you very much for your work.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for driving that. And thanks for joining us on The Alternative Exit. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to continue learning about employee ownership as an alternative exit, head across to abettermonday.me for additional links and resources. You can also make sure to subscribe or follow along in your favorite podcast app, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review.